Hey everyone, welcome to You've Got This, Confronting Your Inner Critic. We're so glad that you're here and you can make time today. I'm Kristen Costa and I'm Senior Communications Manager here at Octave, and I'm so excited to introduce you to our two incredible speakers today. First up, we have Carlos M. Flores. He is an experienced therapist for Octave in Southern California. He has a ton of experience working with young adults and college students through things like anxiety, stress, life transitions, so much more. And also, he's a student himself. He's in a doctorate program for professional psychology, so he really gets some of the unique struggles that students might face. We also have Samantha Bender, a wonderful therapist based out in El Paso, Texas, who's really passionate about working with young adults through things like anxiety, burnout, depression. I mean, you name it, she's got you covered. And if you're a little curious to learn more about Octave, we're a modern mental health practice. We're available in 7 different states where we offer a mix of in-person and teletherapy. And the big thing to know about us is we partner with insurance companies to make sure that mental health care is both affordable and effective, because we really believe that folks should be able to access the care they need whenever they need it. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into today's workshop. We're not going to have our chat open, but we will have our Q&A, and we're also going to have some webinar polls. So please just keep an eye out for opportunities to engage and share your thoughts with us. We're going to have a live Q&A session with Carlos and Samantha at the end. So feel free to drop in questions as we go to make sure we can get to them. And if we can't during the live Q&A, we have clinical director and therapist Helen Brody here. She's going to try to answer some questions in the Q&A box if we can't get to them. So you can keep an eye out for that. And then lastly, at the end, we're going to invite you to fill a survey so we could hear your feedback and learn how to improve these workshops. So without further ado, let's get to it. I'd like to welcome Carlos and Samantha.
Thank you for this awesome introduction, Kristen. So let's see here. I'd like to start this off with an anecdote, which is actually a Tumblr post by one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman. You may know him from the Netflix series The Sandman, the Showtime series American Gods, or the stop motion film Coraline. So the post reads like this. Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to a gathering of great and good people, artists and scientists, writers and discoverers of things. And I felt that at any moment, they would realize that I didn't qualify to be there among these people who had really done things. On my second or third night there, I was standing at the back of the hall while a musical entertainment happened, and I started talking to a very nice, polite, elderly gentleman about several things, including our shared first name. And then he pointed to the hall of people and said words to the effect of, I just look at all these people and I think, well, what the heck am I doing here? They've made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. And I said, yes, but you were the first man on the moon. I think that counts for something. And I felt a bit better, because if Neil Armstrong felt like an imposter, maybe everyone did. Maybe there aren't any grown-ups, only people who'd worked hard and got lucky and were slightly out of their depth. All of us just doing the best job that we could, which is all we could really hope for.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Carlos. I absolutely love Coraline. So it's kind of wild to hear that the person who created such a beloved story feels like a fraud. If you've ever experienced this idea that I don't belong here, I'm not good enough, I'm a fraud, what if they figure it out? You're in good company. So in addition to the people that you see here, who I feel like we can agree are pretty objectively successful, people like Michelle Obama, Simone Biles, Lady Gaga, Sonia Sotomayor, all of these people and way more have experienced imposter phenomenon at some point in their life. In college, with young adults, about 1 in 5 students do experience imposter syndrome, and this actually greatly increases in the professional setting.
So now we're going to ask you to take a quick poll here. So I'm going to ask if any of you relate to the statement. Sometimes I'm afraid others will discover how much knowledge or ability I really lack. We'll take a moment here, and if you're open to it, go ahead and enter your choice here. All right, so it looks like about 61% of us have at some point felt this way. 38 at some times and 1% not at all. That 1% can send us a message and let us know what the trick is. So if this isn't validating enough, let's go on to this next slide and acknowledge the fact that, in fact, 8 in 10 people experience feelings of imposter syndrome at some point in their life.
And judging by the amount of yeses and sometimes that we had, we can probably all remember some point in our life when feeling like an imposter or not feeling good enough took away from our feelings of success, our feelings of pride, our happiness, and even our feelings of worth.
So feeling like an imposter can sometimes put a damper on significant life experiences, like going off to college or earning our first internship or job or graduating. In this workshop, we'll discuss ways to mitigate the feelings of imposter phenomenon through recognition, the easy part, and acceptance, the not so easy part.
Absolutely. So we'll start by talking about what imposter phenomenon even is and what it isn't. I do want to add that for today's purposes, we're talking about imposter phenomenon as we'll kind of define it later. We're not necessarily addressing things like being in a toxic environment or hearing negative messages from others, your entire life, because that is something else that can contribute to imposter phenomenon, but it's usually its own set of issues. We also want you to recognize signs that you might be experiencing imposter phenomenon and how to manage these feelings, whether it's in a professional or a personal setting.
So we'd like to invite you to take a few seconds to reflect on your own experience of imposter phenomenon. Now let's get into the myths. Myth 1, imposter syndrome, and you'll notice we'll be using this interchangeably, is a diagnosis. So first off, it's not a syndrome. Somewhere along the line, as imposter phenomenon entered the zeitgeist, it became more commonly known as imposter syndrome, which suggests that it's diagnostic in nature. It's not. In fact, it's one of the many psychological experiences that make up the spectrum of the human experience and is not likely covered by your insurance. So we will be using these terms interchangeably because, just like the Death Cab for Cutie song says, there are different names for the same thing. So the phenomenon was first identified by psychologists Susanna Imes and Pauline Rose Clance in the late 1970s. They defined it as an internal experience of intellectual phoniness. In this seminal study, they found that high-achieving women endorsed the belief that they were fooling their peers into believing that they were bright and worthy of the positions they held, despite their objective achievements.
So as Carlos just shared, a lot of the early research, if not all of it, was done using women in the workplace. So as expected, that's what most of our current research has information for as well. There is also a lot of research that shows that BIPOC individuals and women absolutely do experience imposter phenomenon on a much higher rate than whites and males. The myth, however, is that it only affects certain people in certain life circumstances. So the problem is that we can kind of lose sight of some of the bigger issues, right? If we are only addressing how women and BIPOC individuals feel. Because if we say, oh, it's just imposter phenomenon and brush that away, we're not looking at the systemic issues. We're not looking at how is this person supported? Do they feel like they see others like them in successful areas and in successful positions? So the truth is anyone can experience these thoughts and feelings of being an imposter at any point in their lives. So for a lot of people, college is the first time that they experience it. You're in a really highly competitive pool of others. And for the first time, there's a lot of competition.
Myth 3, positive thinking is the solution. Well, if this was the case, Octave wouldn't be hosting this workshop, and Samantha and I would likely be looking for new jobs. The danger in relying too heavily on positive thinking is called toxic positivity, which is the excess and ineffective overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state across all situations. This can result in denial, minimization, and invalidation of the authentic human emotional experience. Now, this isn't to say that positive thinking has no place in our lives. rather than it's simply the yang to the yin that is negativity. We can't have one without the other, and that's okay.
And related to thinking, myth number 4 is if I feel this way or I think this way, it must be true. So we just want to remind you that thoughts are not facts. They're interpretations of the current situation or current group of situations that are based on your past experiences, current circumstances, like if you're hungry, if you're tired, if you're sick, anything like that, and everything that happened right before that event or years ago. So, for example, let's say you're from a rural area on the West Coast and you go to your dream college in a major metropolitan city like LA. Even if you spent most of your life just a few hours or a couple hundred miles away, the cultural differences can feel like an uncrossable chasm. You may wonder if you belong there and if you fit in. And the more you think about that, you may actually start to believe it, which leads to some behaviors that might, make you more isolated from others. You're not doing your favorite things, which in turn increases the thoughts. You might just feel kind of like a fake or an outsider, and you might worry that other people will find out.
Myth 5, these feelings will persist throughout life. While imposter phenomenon may show up at different times in our lives, it's often a reaction to our environmental and circumstantial stressors. Feelings of imposter phenomenon can and will dissipate if we're open to addressing them. Now, I'd like to share a story, and if you haven't figured it out now, I like anecdotes, I like stories, and this is actually a story that was shared by one of our colleagues about her growing up. So I'll go ahead and read it here. Growing up on an apple orchard in upstate New York and living in a small rural town, I wasn't exposed to any kind of competitive landscape. I was a high achiever, simply because I had plans to go to college. I attended a prominent university in New York, getting both a bachelor's and a master's degree, but it wasn't until I moved to San Francisco, California, that I felt really out of place. I felt as if I had excelled in upstate New York simply because the area wasn't competitive. Living in San Francisco humbled me on so many levels. I had been an avid runner, but I felt like I couldn't go on runs unless I was training for a marathon because no one in San Francisco just dabbles in something. It's always taking it to the highest, most competitive level. This was really demoralizing at first because I felt like I couldn't even do something I loved without training for this really serious and competitive event. I found that the people around me had a hard time just reading for fun. Everyone was on an intense path for self-betterment. They couldn't read fiction. It had to be nonfiction about hacking a specific part of your life. That said, with that example, it is circumstantial and oftentimes is environmental when we feel these feelings.
Absolutely. And I also kind of like visualization and imagery and that kind of thing. So I want to talk a little bit about recognizing imposter phenomenon in yourself. Because as Carlos addressed earlier, no, it is not necessarily a diagnosis or a syndrome, but it's still important. Okay. So I want you to just imagine that you're looking up at the night sky on a clear night, far away from any city lights. You see hundreds of stars. Those are only the stars that are visible to the naked eye. Some look like they may be part of a constellation. Some may not be. And we have some that we've agreed as a society are this constellation, right? Even if they don't quite make sense to us, we've agreed on it, they're there. Regardless, even if a star is part of a constellation or not, it still exists and it's still worth seeing. The same is true for symptoms of imposter phenomenon. It's absolutely still worth talking about and still addressing. So we're going to talk about the 5 well-known types of imposter phenomenon, and then we'll kind of reveal a 6th type that we have found to be pretty common among our clients. There might be some overlap, and that can be expected. We don't all just kind of fit into these neat boxes. And like Carlos said, this is really just part of the human experience.
So starting off with the types, we have the perfectionist. This person often hyperfixates on how a thing should be done and may have even been accused of micromanaging projects or assignments. They are rarely satisfied with anything less than the gold standard of excellence, and they may feel more prone to procrastination, all or nothing thinking, and may be more susceptible to burnout. Questions to consider if you relate to this are, do you set high and sometimes unrealistic standards? Next is the expert. You may have met this person and noticed that they really know their stuff. This desire to know most about a specific subject is often to please those around them. You may notice these folks reading the latest research or taking an excess of courses and trainings in preparation for a big project or presentation. And reading this out loud, I kind of recognize I'm calling myself out. I wrote this though, so I'll forgive myself and move on here. Right. Left unchecked, imposter phenomenon can lead the expert to experience low self-esteem or burnout because they're trying to learn all the time. For example, if you pulled multiple all-nighters for an exam you're actually well prepared for, you may relate to the expert. The soloist. The soloist often feels pressure to work alone and then shine. They are critical of incompetence of others and in themselves, out of fear of being found out for incompetence. The soloist may minimize themselves in an effort to stay hidden. They feel like they might need more time to prepare. They may prefer solo projects over group collaborations and are less likely to ask for help, even when they recognize they could benefit from it. So questions you can ask yourself are, do I feel obligated to work alone? Do I avoid asking people for help or input?
Awesome. Thanks, Carlos. I'm going to take over the other three types. So the next one that we're looking at is called the natural genius. So the natural genius was that smart kid in class, right? They didn't have to exert much effort. Maybe they didn't study to pass tests. Even sports seemed to come natural to them. And they engaged in those things that felt natural to them. When it doesn't, however, they might assume that they failed or there's not something there that they can manage or they're not good enough. There's all these different thoughts that can cross their mind. They equate trying and working hard with not being intelligent. And if intelligence, especially natural intelligence, is part of your identity and something you value, if you think that you're not living up to this expectation, it can be incredibly damaging. So, as an adult, if you haven't resolved some of these issues and some of these thoughts, you may notice that you avoid risks, or maybe you don't even take on new hobbies unless you know that you're going to be good at them. So, a couple questions to consider to ask, am I the natural genius? Do you assume that you failed if something doesn't click right away? And do you rely on your natural intelligence instead of effort? Next, we're going to talk about the superhuman. So I think we all know this person who seems to be taking on so much more all the time, right? It might be the classmate or the coworker who's balancing a job, night classes, volunteering, family, friends, and then some. They still take on extra duties, even though you know that they're doing all of this, even though no one expects them to do it. And yeah, sure, if you ask them to organize the next event, they would love to, even though they haven't, slept in a couple days. And of course, they'd love to be the president of the club. Let's add some sports in there too. The idea is, though, at some point, if you keep adding all of this up, you're probably going to burn out. So you might reach a point where even the most basic tasks seem like a struggle. And the people that you were once supporting and trying to make proud of you are now sources of resentment, which makes the superhuman feel even worse. So if you feel obligated to please everyone around you, and if you really struggle to set boundaries, even when you know you're kind of starting to burn out, you might be the superhuman. And then the last type that we're going to talk about is the comedian. So if you Google imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome, you're not going to see the comedian listed, probably. But this is one that we noticed came up in a lot of our discussions about this topic. There was a lot of clients that didn't quite fit any of the other types. And we noticed that at the base of it, a lot of them were using humor to deflect from uncomfortable situations. So that being said, I think we've all met the comedian. In school, they're the class clown. At work, they're the comedic relief during tense moments. So, like I said, they're probably using humor to deflect from serious topics, especially if they're worried that you might not know the answer or they couldn't give someone what they need. So the problem with this is that at some point, there might come a time where when you actually do start to contribute, people kind of look at you surprised, and that creates this internal thought of, oh, they don't think I'm smart, or, oh my gosh, what did I say? And we internalize some of these negative feelings. They're worried that people might find them out, so they'll use humor and entertaining, right? So if you joke to cope with self-doubt or you avoid emotional vulnerability, you might relate to the comedian. And now you're going to see another Zoom poll question pop up, and we're going to ask which of the 6 types you relate to most, if at all. And I have the slide with the imposter types on there as well in case you need to reference it. I think calling myself out. I'm a little bit of all of these, so I'm just going to go ahead and name it like a dumpster fire, because every time I try to put one of them out, it seems like another one is lit up. So we'll see. And in that case, now that I'm saying it, I might be the comedian.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling the comedian and a little bit of the expert.
Yeah.
I can definitely procrastinate like a perfectionist, though.
Oh, for sure. I'm great at that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering. Yeah, so with the results, we see mostly the perfectionist, a little bit of the expert, fairly even between the comedian and natural genius, and then fairly even between superhuman and soloist. And again, there's that one person who is none of the types. So that offer still stands. You can tell us what you're doing. You can have my job for a little bit, because I definitely want to know. Awesome. So a little caveat before we continue. Having imposter phenomenon isn't necessarily always negative, right? So there is a healthy level of stress, humility, and desire to be better. So for example, the perfectionist can be relied on to get things done correctly. The natural genius is an amazing resource when you need information quick. The expert knows how to find information and always keeps learning. The soloist excels when they're able to comfortably take control of a project. And the superhuman knows how to organize and manage time while they keep their priorities straight. The comedian knows how to read a room and diffuse tension when necessary. A lot of research shows too that people who have imposter phenomenon actually tend to be a little better at interpersonal relationships too, because when we are concerned about how other people see us, we're a little more sympathetic towards how they're feeling. We're more aware of their cues and their body language. That being said, the question is, when is it a problem? The easy and therapist answer is it's a problem when you feel like it's a problem, okay? That being said, maybe you're obsessing over a project at work. You're trying to make it better, even though no one else sees anything wrong with it. You've realized that you've dropped most of your interests or hobbies, or even talking to friends because there's too much going on, or you're forcing yourself to study material you already know. Perhaps your self-esteem is dropped, right? So left unchecked, some of these symptoms can seriously lead to mental health issues, or things like burnout, stress, resentment, and even isolation. So one of the things we really want to emphasize is checking in with yourself, not just for imposter phenomenon, but just in general. Check in with yourself constantly. Ask yourself questions on the larger picture, like, am I feeling burned out? Is this impacting the quality of my relationships with others? What about the relationship with myself? Am I performing how I used to? What about my confidence and self-esteem? So on a day-to-day basis and a moment-to-moment basis, you can also check in and ask yourself, when is the last time I ate? When is the last time I stepped away from my desk? When is the last time that you gave yourself some recognition for the progress you have made? When is the last time you prioritized your to-do list? All of these questions and more can help kind of mitigate some of those feelings of imposter phenomenon, and they're phenomenal to reduce burnout as well.
All right. So now that we've identified how imposter phenomenon can show up differently in different people, let's talk about how to manage some of these feelings. Feelings of insecurity can stem from misalignment of values and behaviors. Value mapping can be an effective tool to address these misalignments. Values, just like us, evolve over time as priorities change. Value mapping can be a helpful tool for addressing these misalignments. You'll know your values because you may have acted on them over the past few days. Here's a list of some values that might speak to you. You'll notice that there's a fair amount, and these are not an exhaustive list by any means. And values, right, are very subjective, right? What's most important to me might not be most important to Samantha, and vice versa. And like I mentioned before, values do change. So now we'd like to invite you to engage in this, to engage in the question, the Q&A aspect, and identify these values. So what are your top 3 values? 3 to 5. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to this. And please feel free to add anything else that's not on this list. And we'll go ahead and check out that Q&A.
Absolutely. And while we're waiting for those to come in, we just want to address that values are not inherently good or bad. There aren't some that are better or worse than the other. They're simply the things that you hold to be important.
So other ways that you might be able to determine your values are identifying the times when you were happiest, times where you were the most proud, times where you felt the most fulfilled and satisfied. This can help determine what these top values are. So we've got some coming in here. We've got empathy, success, awareness, joy, humor, family. Family's coming up a couple times. Sam, what would you say are yours?
Yeah. So for me, I think authenticity is one of my most important. I value that in others, and that's how I try to come through as a person just in my day-to-day life and as a therapist. Humor is definitely important to me. And honestly, we don't normally like to talk about it as therapists, but feeling financially secure is incredibly important. What about you, Carlos?
Oh, let's see here. Nature, for sure. Community, right? Which is something I've been able to tap into working on this workshop with you and the rest of the team, which has been awesome. Humor actually is coming up a lot too. Humor is certainly one of those values. And also a challenge. I like challenging myself. Yeah.
Yeah. I love reading all of these answers because there are so many different ones and they're all just as important. I see some like poise, altruism, maturity. We do definitely see I see some patterns, things like empathy, kindness, challenge, God, spirituality.
Oh, yeah. Acceptance. I like that. Honesty. All right.
I did see a question about answering if the chat is disabled, right where you're asking that question. We're just using the Q&A for today.
Yeah.
Transparency, hard to decide, just a few. I feel like I value all of these things. I love that. Love that. Because it can be really hard to choose. So thank you for pointing out it's hard to decide. I know for me, what I like to do with clients, if they're having a hard time deciding, is we actually go through like a value sorting website, and it has these values and more, and you're able to kind of put them into piles of, extremely important, neutral, less important, not important. And that can be really helpful as well if you're having a hard time picking.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get on to the next ways to manage this. All right. Thank you all for jumping in on that. So let's talk a little bit about frustration tolerance. So frustration tolerance is the ability to overcome obstacles and withstand stressful events. Ways to build your frustration tolerance can include, easier said than done, accepting tough situations. A little simpler, maybe not easy, but giving yourself a pep talk. Learning how to calm your body. And this can be done through grounding techniques, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or watching funny raccoon videos on TikTok, because I do love myself some Crash Pandas. Practicing frustration tolerance. And what can that look like? Well, it kind of basically what it sounds like, right? Offering yourself the opportunity to challenge yourself by putting yourself in reasonably frustrating situations. An example might be if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by social situations, and keeping in mind with what's happened over the pandemic, we have effectively learned how to be hermits, and re-entering into an actual population it's been kind of difficult for a few folks, right? So practicing some of these things, offering yourself opportunities to challenge yourself and to grow from these things. That said, I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that imposter phenomenon can also interact with other feelings, right? Anxiety, depression, ADHD as well. This can also tap into, it can interfere with frustration tolerance. Other ways to address this is getting some therapeutic support, right? Giving yourself opportunities to better define what frustration tolerance looks like for you, and the interplay on that in other parts of your life. Okay. All right, let's talk about self-esteem. It takes self-esteem to confront your inner critic. So how do you do that? And while it's not as simple or easy as deciding to be a certain way, it certainly isn't impossible. So self-esteem isn't something you're born with. It is something that necessitates deliberate practice and consistent practice, because by practicing a skill, we can gain competence in it with the hope that we feel more confident in the future. So self-esteem practices can be being kind to yourself, accepting who you are, moving and staying active through dance, yoga, a walk around your neighborhood, or other kinds of exercise, welcoming mistakes as part of growth, remembering to forgive yourself, surrounding yourself with supportive people, focusing on the things that you can change, doing what makes you happy within reason, like not like a purge situation or anything, right? Celebrating the small stuff, like finally writing that paper that was assigned in the beginning of the semester and getting it done in about 5 hours with no sleep. Being a friend to someone, and positive self-affirmations, which are basically affirming yourself, telling yourself that you did a good job, and doing these things out loud.
Absolutely. Just to touch on the positive self-affirmations, there is an app that I really like and I encourage people to use if they would like to work on positive self-affirmations. It's called I Am. And basically throughout the day, you'll receive different positive affirmations that you can reflect on and read or say out loud to yourself. And it's a really great way to make sure that you're having some positive thoughts, especially if you are experiencing some other negative thoughts. So now we're going to look at a couple of evidence-based practices that can help with feelings of imposter phenomenon. And evidence-based practices are basically treatment modalities or ways of treating different mental health diagnoses or symptoms that have gone through some research. So that could be something like, strengths-based modalities. Okay. So like Carlos was saying, building up self-esteem, recognizing your values, all of that goes into some of these strengths-based modalities. So in general, it's a psychotherapy approach that focuses on your unique strengths and skills and past experiences over deficits. Okay. So the idea is we look at what your strengths are. We look at how you might have used them in the past to solve a problem, especially if it's a similar problem that you're going through now. We look at how you've used your strengths more generally and more recently, right? So, for example, if the perfectionist is someone who one of their strengths is that they are really good at double checking their work, they're really good at noticing if there's errors in what they're typing, that kind of thing. Those are some of their strengths, right? So then you'll work with them, or you'll work with your therapist to decide, okay, how do I use these strengths that I have, right? And how do I add to them and make them work for me? So you'll often see a strengths-based modality used kind of in partnership with other modalities as well. So you might see it used with cognitive behavioral therapy, any sort of like narrative therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, just all kinds of different treatments really do focus on this idea of you have your unique strengths. And those are absolutely worth, number one, celebrating, and number two, using to help you feel like you're the best version of yourself. And then another fairly common type of therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I will say that probably the majority of, or at least a lot of octave therapists do use cognitive behavioral therapy with a strengths-based approach. We pride ourselves in using evidence-based modalities. So I know I personally use cognitive behavioral therapy in a variety of ways. So the idea is that this is more of a structured and goal-oriented type of talk therapy. And we're focusing on thoughts and behaviors and how they impact each other. So if you ever work with a CBT therapist or me, you'll kind of see them use like a triangle. And yes, this is my cognitive triangle. And basically the idea is at the top, we have our thoughts. And then in one corner, we have our emotions. And in the other corner over here, we have our behaviors. And imagine that on the side, there's a double-sided arrow, okay? And what that's showing us is that all of these are interacting with each other back and forth, right? Our thoughts can change our emotions, our behaviors can change our emotions. If we are, thinking a certain way, we might act a certain way, all of that kind of fun stuff. So, especially for imposter phenomenon, if you were working with a therapist and using CBT, what you would probably do, at least one technique, is learn how to identify cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions generally tend to be fairly negative, fairly vague, and pretty extreme ways of thinking, right? So for example, if somebody gets a C on a test and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to pass, I might as well just drop out. That's a pretty extreme thought, right? It's ignoring all of their past successes. It's not very fact-based. It's more emotion-based. So in that situation, you would want to learn how to check the facts of the situation, right? The fact is, you got to see if there's a work project and it didn't go well and you got negative feedback from your boss, that's the fact of the situation. So at this point, we want to leave out any interpretations, any sort of emotions that may be clouding the facts of the situation. And later you'll pull them back in. But when you're experiencing negative thoughts or imposter phenomenon, just at least remember the phrase, check the facts. Is this true? Is there evidence this isn't true? And that's how we challenge the negative thoughts, by checking the facts. And then what we want to do is kind of take all of that and put it together and create a more realistic way of thinking. So let's say we take that part of, I got a C, and then we also take the part of, but I've made A's on everything else. And we combine them together. So instead of, I got a C on this one test, I'm going to fail out and I'm never going to be a doctor and everybody hates me and that whole spiral, instead we can take it and say, yes, I got a C on this test. And in the past, I've made good grades, right? And it's just a simple way of thinking that accepts what happened and also gives you credit for what you deserve the credit for. I think another great point to point out is that it's not just cognitive. There's also some behavioral techniques. So one of the things that you can do is plan activities or hobbies that you enjoy. Number one, like that's a huge thing, because that's going to create some positive emotions, which in turn is going to create those positive thoughts, right? We have our triangle. And the other thing is picking hobbies or activities that you can build mastery over time, because that will help mitigate some of the ideas of I'm not good at this, or I'm a fraud, that kind of thing. So all kinds of things that you can do. So much more I could talk about. But yeah, that's kind of a brief, not brief overview of CBT. The other thing is just talking in general goes a long way. So when we talk about things with each other, with our therapists, with coworkers, we tend to notice that we're not the only person feeling this way, right? We normalize things like imposter phenomenon by talking about it, which in turn can build a sense of belonging. It's actually a pretty good feeling when you say, hey, I'm feeling like a total fraud and I don't know what the heck I'm doing. And your friend says, yeah, no, me neither. And then your boss says, yeah, no, you're not supposed to. Like nobody does, right? It kind of builds a sense of community, of belonging, of acceptance, of, I'm right where I need to be right now, and that's okay. And as you build that comfort and self-esteem, maybe by practicing with a therapist at first, you can talk about it with others. So if that feels intimidating right now, that's okay. You can always practice.
All right. So if the first person to step foot on the moon has experienced imposter phenomenon, I think it's safe to say your friends probably have too. And again, like Sam said, right, there is a lot of validation being able to have these conversations with people who you care for and respect, and who respect and care for you. So destigmatizing imposter phenomenon by having workshops like this, and the various TED Talks on the internet, conversations with friends and family. These are helpful ways to address the feelings that can come up with regard to imposter phenomenon. So to recap, to mitigate feelings of imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, let your values guide you. Find ways to build up your frustration tolerance, adopt self-esteem building practices, and build community through conversation.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Samantha, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I know we got more. Y'all got more to share here. If you haven't shared a question in the Q&A yet, please go ahead and drop it in. Either we will answer it live, or therapist and clinical director Helen Brody will try to get back to you. But let's kick things off with our first question here. Sam, someone asked, how will knowing my imposter type help me?
Oh, awesome. So that is a great question. All of the questions are going to be great, so ignore that part. But I like to think of this, and it's kind of a silly comparison, but I like it, as similar to a snake bite. Okay, so hear me out. Snakes have different types of venom, right? So if you go to the doctor and you just say, hey, I have a snake bite, they're going to ask you what kind of snake. And if you don't know, they're going to explore it with you, right? The reason for that is because there's a different type of venom, there's also a different type of antivenom. So if we're looking at imposter phenomenon as kind of that snake, and then the type says, hey, here's the venom, then the treatment and how we approach it is the antivenom. So for example, a perfectionist might not benefit from the same type of treatment or same type of, changes in their life as like a comedian might. That's where I would say it's most important to know your imposter phenomenon type.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Another question we have here is, what are some good resources to help me learn even more about imposter syndrome? Carlos, you want to?
Totally. Yes. So there is a book out by Amy Cuddy. It's called Presence, Bringing Your Boldest Self to Your Biggest Challenges. It's on Kindle, it's on paper, and it's also an audiobook, right? If you want to kind of mix up some of that movement, right, to manage feelings of imposter phenomenon while also listening to something that can be helpful. And in that book, actually, she does interview Neil Gaiman as well.
Love what Neil has to share about his own feelings. So great. All right. So how about social media? That's something that can create a lot of pressure. Someone asks, will deleting social media help me manage these feelings?
Another great question. Maybe is the answer, because again, I know everybody loves to hear the it depends answer from a therapist. It really depends on what's going on in life and where you are. If there are signs that some of the feelings of imposter phenomenon are not being good enough, do you come from comparison from social media, then maybe taking a break is a good idea. Carlos, what do you think?
I'm with you on that, right? I think it's very subjective. It's a very subjective thing, right? I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that, whatever we're consuming is what's fueling us. And if what we're consuming are negative, unrealistic expectations, unrealistic, ideas of self-worth, it can be a problem, right? So I know for myself, I like to keep my social media on timers. So I've got 25 minutes for Instagram. I've got an hour and 30 minutes for Reddit. That one's kind of a harder one because there's a lot of pictures of pandas on there. So it's a matter of like what works for you. What you said earlier, Sam, about just checking in with yourself, asking yourself, right? What is the value of this? Being mindful of the relationships you have, not only with the people that you care about and who care about you, also institutions, ideas, philosophies, right? I mean, talking about values, something that I didn't mention, I think is worth acknowledging is the fact that, like I mentioned, our values do change. And the values that we start off with are the values that we're raised in. right? And that being said, as we get older, we're exposed to different ideas. And oftentimes these ideas do come from social media, from media, right? And it's going back to what you said, it's important to check in. So it depends.
Love starting and ending on it depends, but totally resonates to hear about the importance of just checking in with yourself and being able to track change too. Another question we have back to the types. Can I be a mix of perfectionist, expert, and superhuman?
Absolutely. Think about how those kind of lend themselves to each other too, right? Maybe, one of those started before the other, maybe they kind of started around the same time. But if you're somebody who wants things to be perfect, I think it can kind of naturally lend itself to that overexertion of I need to study, I need to constantly be learning more. And then that can show up in other parts of our lives. Because don't forget, this doesn't just limit itself to work or to school. Sometimes it can kind of bleed over into other parts of our lives, like even being a perfectionist in our relationships, in our family, in our culture. All sorts of ways it can come up. So absolutely, any of those can be mixed together.
Yeah, it totally makes sense that we'd feel like we could be multiple types at once. Another question we have here is, how do you work with clients that have low self-esteem?
Carlos, would you like to answer? I can. I just know I've been talking a lot.
Totally, yeah. So, okay, when it comes to self-esteem, right? I think the biggest thing to look, or the thing that I usually look at, right, is having a conversation about what your relationship looks like with you, right? So, I think doing the value mapping can be a very helpful thing, right? Acknowledging areas in which you do feel empowered, right? And if there aren't areas that you can think of, right, it's also then challenging yourself to try new things. I had someone tell me once a while back, and I love this. I failed my way to success, right? And if we're taking on that kind of perspective, well, are failures even failures if we're learning from them, or is it just one more way to get toward where we're trying to get to? I would like to hear your thoughts on this, Sam.
Yeah. So little background on me and why I was trying to say like a totally different word other than imposter. I was an interpersonal communications major before psychology caught my attention. So I tend to look at how communication and how relationships affect our mental health and our things like self-esteem. Oftentimes we can come back to, in childhood, what did you hear about yourself? How did you see those negative thoughts kind of perpetuated? How did you challenge those kinds of questions? So I like to start there and kind of help unravel some of those really kind of core beliefs and then move forward.
That's so helpful. And I'm going to build on that, Samantha, with another question we have here. How can you adopt new behaviors that combat your inner critic when you struggle to communicate your feelings with others?
Absolutely. So the thing is sometimes adopting new behaviors is kind of a trial and error. Okay. So what works for you might not work for someone else. And remember, we don't always have to communicate the feelings necessarily, but we can communicate the thoughts that are associated with the feelings, right? So I kind of like to differentiate between thoughts and feelings because it can be really helpful in understanding. I can tell someone what I'm thinking without necessarily having to practice that emotional vulnerability if I'm not ready to. With adopting new behaviors, I like to look for, inspiration from others. I mean, this is where things like TikTok and Instagram and Pinterest can actually come in handy because you can get some of that inspiration and trying one new thing at a time. And there's something called habit stacking, which can be really helpful even for imposter phenomenon. And the idea is that you add a new habit to a pre-existing one. Okay. So in this case, let's say that every night you take your medicine, brush your teeth, and lay down. So after you lay down, maybe you can add in something like journaling about what your thoughts are, and then getting in tune with what emotions that might make you feel. And behaviors like that, I think, can go a long way.
I'd like to add a little bit to that as well. So something that I like to be mindful of in building new practices, right, is acknowledging the fact that goal creation And meeting these goals is very much a zero-sum game, which can be somewhat defeating, right? When we're not able to like, oh, well, I didn't meet the 3 times, I didn't run 3 times in the week. So I think it can be helpful to change the language that we're using. So rather than saying I'm setting a goal for myself, setting an intention, right? So if you set an intention to exercise, what can that look like? Well, it can look anything like taking a walk around the block to taking a run around the block. It can be a 10-mile hike, right? As long as we're meeting this intention, we're feeling empowered. We're following through with these things. So exercise can be anything from that. And I mean, we can think. I mean, it could be Just Dance, right? Like as a video game, right? So offering yourself a little more grace and kindness when you're setting larger goals for yourself. But I like that idea of habit stacking as well, right? And managing your expectations, right? Because if I set a goal for myself to reach the moon by the end of the year, well, I'm going to be pretty disappointed if that doesn't happen. So it's like, well, what can I do to start working towards that if that's one of my goals? Well, maybe it's going to be training for decathlons, right? Or marathons, and figuring out how that's going to look on moving forward, right?
So helpful to hear about that role that grace and kindness for yourself plays. We have so many good questions here, y'all, so I'm going to keep carrying us through. This next one is, do you have any tips on getting past the paralysis caused by imposter syndrome? So like as a perfectionist type, I'll be scared to be imperfect, so I'll just not start. And I can acknowledge and name that this is imposter syndrome and a problem, but how do I turn that into a change in behavior?
Yeah,
Whoever wants
absolutely.
to jump in, go for it.
Yeah. I actually want to address the idea of not wanting to ask for help and revealing that lack of knowledge. There was a book that I read a few years ago at this point called The Go Giver. And the idea is that when we're asking for help, it's not us necessarily like showing vulnerability or showing we're not good enough. We're not supposed to know all the answers, right? That's okay. We are part of communities and societies for a reason. We're supposed to ask for help. And I think what the best part of the Go Giver was for me was understanding that when you ask someone for help, you are actually opening up the room and the space for them to share their unique experiences and their unique skills with you. And it's this way of helping them by letting them help you, if that makes sense. It's really this opportunity for them to realize that they're making a difference too. So I encourage people to look at receiving help as also providing space for people to be themselves and share their gifts. Carlos, I feel like you probably have some information about like being scared to just start.
Yeah. Yes. So I think something that can be helpful too, right? And we're talking about like practices, right? So what's one way acknowledging the perfectionist, right? And having this fear to be imperfect. Something that you can try is starting a task and then not finishing it and just leaving it, right? Sounds a lot more difficult, right? Than just doing the thing. So finding ways to practice these things, right? So starting a task and not finishing it, or starting a task with the intention of not doing it well, right? And there are other things, of course, and like kind of figuring out and offering time and space to figure out what else this can look like. And to do that, you can ask yourself, what's going to make me feel most uncomfortable, right? Not delivering something on time, right? Or setting up a presentation or something like that. So finding ways to practice some of this frustration tolerance, right? And not completing something or not having something come out as perfect as you would like it to.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Or doing something. Oh, sorry, Kristen.
I'm not going to interrupt you, Samantha. Go for it.
I was going to say doing something just to do it is also really helpful, I think. Not having an expectation for what the end result looks like because it's not about that. So in hobbies and stuff, just kind of seeing where it takes you and just curiosity. And yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I think we have time for at least one more question here. Do affirmations work even when you don't believe in them? Saying something like, I am beautiful, even though you don't really feel that way.
Short answer, no. So for affirmations to be helpful, it's not that we necessarily have to believe in them wholeheartedly, But if we don't feel them and we don't see how they could be true either now or eventually, it's not going to be helpful, because what we're probably going to do is have this thought of, I know that's not true, or I don't think that's true, right? And a lot of these are also subjective, right? Again, they're not necessarily facts, they're not objective. So with something like I am beautiful, because that can be a really difficult thing for people to say to themselves, even if it's true and even if they should feel that way. So maybe focusing on things like, I constantly look for ways to make myself feel more confident, right? And looking at things as I am in the process of achieving this goal, if that makes sense. We don't have to necessarily keep to those I am beautiful, I'm smart. If they work for you, awesome. If not, it's okay to build yourself up to that.
Yeah, and I think too, right, like changing that operational definition, or at least clarifying it, right? While I am beautiful as a whole may not speak to you, pick a part of yourself that is beautiful. Whether it's going to be your hair or your hands or your skin, right? A lot of this is, at the end of the day, it's practice. And it takes practice to feel competent in something, and then feel confident, right? There are no shortcuts, right? I mean, I'm sure we all have stories or examples of times where we were told, hey, this is a good shortcut, and it actually made more work for us. You got to be authentic, right? Like Samantha was saying. So finding things, managing your expectations as well, finding things that do ring true to you. Yeah.
So helpful. Just thank you so much, Samantha and Carlos, for sharing your wisdom with all of us. Thank you to everyone here for these really powerful questions. I just feel like I'm learning so much. I hope everyone here did too. And we want to hear from you about what this workshop was like for all of you here. Please scan this QR code, get your cell phones out. We would love to know how to make these better. We want to know about what you would like to hear therapists talk about in the future. And with that, we just want to say thank you to everyone for being here, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen.